All right, so today we're going to be taking a deep dive into a book that's been really messing with my mind lately in a good way.
Right.
It's called The Spiritual Code and Symbology of the Living Word by this guy, Dr. Roy. And let me tell you, he's got some pretty wild
I've
ideas.
heard of this book.
Yeah,
Yeah, his interpretations are definitely outside the box.
yeah, for sure. And one of the things that totally caught my attention was this concept that we're not just human beings, we're visible spirit.
Yeah, that's like his central thesis, right? It's a big shift from the traditional way of looking at things.
Totally. And at first I was kind of like, what? Visible spirit? What does that even mean? But the more I sat with it, the more it started to resonate with me, you know?
Yeah, I get that. It's a pretty profound idea when you really think about it. Like it kind of reclines what it means to be alive and to have this connection to something bigger than ourselves.
Right. And Dr. Roy even says we should ditch the word human altogether and just start calling ourselves visible spirit.
He does. He's pretty serious about that,
Yeah.
which is interesting. Like it makes you wonder how much of the Bible's true message has been lost in translation. You know what I mean?
Totally.
Right.
Maybe we've been misinterpreting things for centuries because we're starting from the wrong premise.
That's a key point Dr. Roy makes. He believed there are all these codes and symbols in the Bible that have been overlooked or misinterpreted.
Okay, so give me an example. What kind of codes are we talking about?
Well, take the idea of the virgin birth of Jesus. Most people point to Isaiah 7.15 as proof, but Dr. Roy says the word virgin. There is actually a mistranslation.
A mistranslation, really?
Yeah, the original Hebrew word doesn't actually mean virgin. It's more like something kept out of sight or hidden. So he's saying that verse isn't even about Jesus.
Whoa. Hold on. So if that verse isn't about Jesus, then what's the deal with the virgin birth?
Well, Dr. Roy points to Luke 3, where they trace Jesus' lineage all the way back to Adam, and even calls Adam a son of God.
Okay, so if Jesus is descended from Adam, who was a son of God, then the whole virgin birth thing becomes kind of a moot point.
Exactly. And that leads into another big idea Dr. Roy tackles, the concept of original sin.
Oh man, original sin. That one always tripped me out as a kid.
Yeah, it's a heavy concept. But Dr. Roy argues that original sin is another case of mistranslation and misinterpretation. He says that the Garden of Eden story, when translated correctly from the original Hebrew, doesn't actually say that humanity inherited sin from Adam.
Whoa, seriously? So what does that even mean for things like baptism then?
Well, Dr. Roy has a pretty interesting perspective on that, too. He sees baptism as more of a symbolic awakening to our true nature as sons of God, rather than a ritual for washing away sins.
Okay, so it's not about being cleansed of this inherent badness, but more about recognizing that we're already connected to something divine.
Exactly. He uses the story of the eunuch in Acts 8 as an example. Remember, the eunuch is baptized without even saying a sinner's prayer, which suggests that acknowledging our inherent connection to God is the real essence of baptism.
Huh. You know, when you put it like that, it makes you think about all those big moments in your own spiritual life. What did they really mean? Were they about wiping the slate clean? Or were they about realizing something deeper about yourself?
That's exactly the kind of introspection that Dr. Roy encourages. He wants us to question those assumptions and really dig into the symbolism of the Bible.
And speaking of symbolism, he also has some pretty wild ideas about the significance of numbers in the Bible, especially the number 4.
Oh, yeah. The number 4 is a big one for him.
So what's so special about the number 4?
Well, he associates it with the physical world and the limitations of a purely material perspective.
Oh, okay. So being stuck in the day-to-day, not seeing the bigger picture kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And he uses the story of Jesus walking on water to illustrate this. Remember, it happened during the 4th watch of the night, which, according to Dr. Roy, symbolizes darkness and a lack of spiritual understanding.
And Jesus, because he was coming from a higher spiritual awareness, was able to transcend those limitations.
Exactly. It's like he's saying, even the seemingly small details in these stories can have these deeper layers of meaning.
That's really cool. I never would have thought about it like that. And it makes me think about all the other stories in the Bible and what hidden meanings might be lurking beneath the surface.
That's what makes this book so fascinating. And this ties into another big idea, Dr. Roy's interpretation of the kingdom of God.
Oh, yeah, the kingdom of God. That's a big one. Isn't that supposed to be like a place we go after we die?
Well, not according to Dr. Roy. He says it's not a physical place or a future event, but an inner state of awareness and connection to the divine. It's about cultivating that relationship within ourselves, accessing what he calls our God mind.
Our God mind. Where is that located? Is it like a secret compartment in our brains?
He associates it with the right brain, the part that's more intuitive and creative. He uses the story of Nicodemus approaching Jesus at night as a metaphor for this.
So Nicodemus coming to Jesus in the dark represents him being in a state of spiritual ignorance. Exactly.
Yeah.
And Jesus guides him towards a deeper understanding and inner knowing, which Dr. Roy argues is the true path to experiencing the kingdom of God.
Wow, that's a whole new way of looking at it. It's not about going somewhere after you die, but about finding that connection right here, right now.
Exactly. And that's just scratching the surface. There's so much more to explore in Dr. Roy's work. It's packed with these insightful interpretations that really challenge the traditional ways of thinking about spirituality in the Bible.
My mind is already blown,
Yeah.
and we've only just begun. This is great.
Welcome back. So last time we were talking about how Dr. Roy sees the kingdom of God as something we experience inside ourselves, not like a physical place you go to.
Right, and I gotta say, that really resonated with me. It feels so much more empowering somehow, you know?
Definitely. It shifts the focus from waiting for something to happen
Yeah.
to actively cultivating that connection with the divine. And that brings us to another really interesting thing Dr. Roy talks about, biblical names and their hidden meanings.
Oh yeah, I was curious about that. What's an example?
Well, he takes the name Gideon, which means hewer or cutter down, and he connects that to Gideon's role in destroying false idols.
So the name itself hints at his destiny. That's kind of cool.
Right. It's like these names are packed with these symbolic clues about a person's spiritual journey or purpose. Then there's Absalom. His name means father of peace.
But wait, didn't Absalom lead a rebellion against his own father, King David? I mean, that doesn't sound very peaceful.
Exactly, and that's what Dr. Roy finds so fascinating. He uses Absalom as an example to show how our outward actions don't always reflect our inner state.
So Absalom might have had peace in his name, but he clearly wasn't living from a place of inner peace.
Right, it's like this dissonance between the name and the actions. It's pretty thought-provoking.
It really is. Makes you think about the names we encounter in our own lives, you know? Like, do they hold any deeper significance?
It's definitely something to ponder. And Dr. Roy encourages us to see the Bible and even our everyday lives as full of these symbolic messages.
It's like this giant treasure hunt for meaning. I love it. Okay, so speaking of hidden depths, there's another concept that I found really intriguing, regeneration. What's Dr. Roy's take on that one?
Oh yeah, regeneration is huge for him. He sees it as this spiritual transformation that goes way beyond any external label like race, religion, social status, all that. It's about recognizing the divine spark that connects us all.
That feels so relevant today, don't you think? Especially with all the division and conflict we see in the world.
Absolutely. Dr. Roy ties this idea of regeneration to the concept of unity. He's basically saying that true spiritual progress leads us to see our inherent connection to all of humanity.
So it's not about becoming a better version of ourselves in like a competitive way, but more about realizing that we're all part of this bigger whole.
Exactly. We're all interconnected. And to really grasp that, Dr. Roy says we need to understand the difference between our right mind and our left mind.
Okay, breakdown time. What's the deal with the right and left mind?
Well, he associates the right mind with spiritual awareness. That's where our intuition, creativity, and connection to the divine reside. The left mind, on the other hand, is more about logic, reason, the material world, all that.
So it's like two different operating systems in our brains.
Yeah, kinda. He uses the story of the Syrophoenician woman who comes to Jesus for healing to illustrate this. Remember, she's super persistent even when Jesus initially resists her request.
Yeah, she doesn't give up easily.
Exactly. And Dr. Roy sees her persistence as a symbol of how our intuition, that right mind, can sometimes push through even when our logical left mind is hesitant.
So she's like that inner voice that's saying, I know what I need, even if it doesn't make logical sense right now.
Exactly. And the fact that Jesus eventually heals her daughter shows how important it is to find a balance between our right and left minds, to listen to both our intuition and our reason.
It makes me wonder, how many times have I ignored my intuition because it didn't seem logical at the time?
That's something Dr. Roy really encourages us to examine. He wants us to get in touch with that God mind and see where it leads us.
This whole idea of the right and left mind is really making me think. It's like a framework for understanding how we make decisions and how we connect with the divine.
It is. And he takes this idea even further by using Herod as an example of what happens when we let our left mind, that material, ego-driven side, take over.
Oh, right, Herod. The guy who had John the Baptist beheaded. Yikes.
Yeah, not a good look. Dr. Roy sees Herod as representing what he calls the carnal consciousness. Basically, that part of us that's obsessed with power, wealth, and fulfilling our desires no matter the cost.
And John the Baptist represents, like, the voice of conscience, which Herod tries to silence.
Exactly. It's a powerful metaphor for how our ego can try to shut down our inner wisdom, our connection to something bigger than ourselves.
So if Herod is the carnal consciousness, what happens when we ignore that inner voice, that connection to the divine?
Well, Dr. Roy suggests that we end up creating a lot of suffering, both for ourselves and for others.
That's a pretty sobering thought, but it also makes me think about how we can make different choices, how we can choose to listen to that inner voice even when it's hard.
Exactly. That's the empowering message here. We're not just victims of our circumstances. We have the power to choose a different path.
I love that. It's like we all have the potential to be Herod or to choose something better.
Absolutely. And to help us choose that better path,
Yeah.
Dr. Roy talks a lot about contact with the divine.
Contact, is that like a phone call with God or something?
Not quite. He uses contact to describe that state of conscious connection with our divine source, that feeling of oneness with something greater than ourselves.
I think I've experienced moments like that where I feel incredibly connected to nature or just this sense of peace and love that's hard to explain.
Exactly. Those are glimpses of what Dr. Roy is talking about. And he believes that this contact isn't something we have to earn. It's our natural state of being.
So we're all already connected, but we just forget or lose touch with that connection.
Yeah, exactly. And he encourages us to strengthen that contact through things like meditation, prayer, spending time in nature, acts of kindness, all that good stuff.
Yeah. Those are all things that make me feel more grounded and connected. It's like they help me tune out the noise of the world and tap into something deeper.
That's it. And the more we cultivate this contact, the more we can access the wisdom, guidance, and strength that come from that connection with the divine.
This is making me rethink so many things about my own spiritual journey. It's less about following rules or seeking something outside of myself, and more about remembering who I truly am and nurturing that connection.
That's the heart of it. And that connection to the divine leads to another important concept, confidence, or what he often calls faith.
Okay, but we're not talking about blind faith here, right?
No, not at all. He sees faith as this deep inner knowing, a trust in the unseen forces that are always supporting us. He even says that true faith is based on a conscious connection with the divine, a recognition of our inherent divinity and our unlimited potential.
I like that definition. It's not about believing something blindly, but about trusting in something deeper, something within ourselves and within the universe.
Exactly. And we cultivate that faith by focusing our thoughts on what we desire, releasing doubts and fears, affirming those positive outcomes we want to see.
So it's about aligning our thoughts and beliefs with the things we want to create.
Yes, Dr. Roy believes that our thoughts and beliefs are incredibly powerful. He even goes so far as to say that we're co-creators with the divine, that our thoughts and beliefs shape our reality.
Whoa, that's a lot of responsibility, but it's also incredibly empowering. It means we're not just passive bystanders in our own lives, but we have the ability to shape our experiences.
Exactly. And Dr. Roy offers a lot of practical advice on how to use this power of thought and belief to create a more fulfilling life.
This is really making me rethink what it means to have faith. It's not just about hoping for the best, but about actively aligning my thoughts and actions with the things I want to manifest.
That's the essence of it.
Yeah.
And it all comes back to that connection with the divine.
I'm feeling so inspired and hopeful right now, and we're not even done yet. What other mind-blowing concepts does Dr. Roy have up his sleeve?
Well, one of those fascinating parts of his book is his interpretation of the Adam and Eve story and the fall of humanity. It's a very different perspective from the traditional view.
Okay, I'm all ears. What's his take on the Garden of Eden?
He sees it not as a literal historical event, but as a symbolic representation of the human tendency to separate ourselves from our divine source.
So not about a real apple and a real snake.
Not in Dr. Roy's view. He sees the serpent as a symbol of the ego, tempting us with knowledge and the illusion of separation.
And the forbidden fruit represents that moment when we choose to believe in that lie.
Exactly. It's when we shift our identity from our true spiritual nature to this limited, ego-driven self.
Like we trade our connection to God for a bite of the apple, so to speak.
Yes, and Dr. Roy suggests that this fall from grace isn't a punishment from God, but a natural consequence of our choices. It's the suffering we create when we buy into that illusion of separation.
So we create our own hell by separating ourselves from the divine.
That's deep. It is. But the good news is Dr. Roy doesn't believe this fall is irreversible. We have the power to reclaim that connection, to return to that Garden of Eden within ourselves.
So it's not about going back to a physical garden, but about reconnecting with that state of wholeness we experienced before we bought into the lie of separation.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the divine spark within us and choosing to live from that place of connection.
This is so powerful. It's giving me a whole new perspective on the Adam and Eve story. It's not about blaming ourselves for some original sin, but about understanding how we create suffering by choosing separation over connection.
It is. And Dr. Roy gives us tools to help us make different choices, to shift our perspective and reclaim that connection.
I feel like I'm getting a whole new education on spirituality. What else does Dr. Roy have to say about how we can access that power within?
Well, he talks a lot about the power of God, but he doesn't see it as something external to us. He believes it's an energy that flows through us, a potential that's within each and every one of us.
So it's not about praying to a God out there, but about tapping into the power that's already inside of us.
Exactly. He says this power is available to us at all times, but we have to choose to access it through our connection to the divine.
How do we do that? Give me some practical tips.
He encourages us to align our thoughts and actions with divine principles, to release limiting beliefs, and to embrace the truth of our inherent divinity.
So it's about living in a way that reflects those qualities we associate with God, like love, compassion, wisdom, generosity, all that.
Yes. And he reminds us that we're not separate from God, but expressions of his love in the world. When we tap into this power, we become agents of healing and transformation.
It's like we all have the potential to be superheroes, not in the comic book sense, but in the sense of making a real difference in the world.
Exactly. And to understand how to access this power, Dr. Roy talks about the difference between Gentiles and those who have a deeper spiritual understanding.
Wait, isn't Gentile just a term for people who aren't Jewish?
That's the common understanding. But Dr. Roy sees it more as a state of consciousness. He uses Gentile to describe those who are focused on the material world, who haven't yet awakened to their spiritual nature.
So it's not about religion, but about how much we're focused on the stuff of the world versus that inner connection.
Exactly. And he says this Gentile consciousness is just a stage of spiritual development, not something bad or wrong. We all start there, but we can move beyond it.
It's like graduating from focusing on material things to realizing that there's so much more to life.
Exactly. And Dr. Roy offers guidance on how we can make that shift, how we can move from that Gentile consciousness to a more awakened state.
This is making me think about all the different stages I've gone through in my own life. There were definitely times when I was super focused on material things, and other times when I felt much more connected to something deeper.
That's the journey. And Dr. Roy encourages us to embrace each stage and keep moving towards greater awareness and connection.
I'm loving this conversation. Dr. Roy's work is so rich and thought-provoking. I feel like I'm discovering a whole new dimension of spirituality.
Me too. And there's still so much more to explore. We haven't even touched on his insights into Paul's journey to Jerusalem or his unique interpretation of the way.
I'm ready for part 3. Bring on the next round of mind-blowing concepts. All right, so we're back. And I gotta say, my mind is still spinning from all this stuff about visible spirit.
Yeah, it's a real game changer, isn't it?
Totally. Like, it's so simple, but it just like reframes everything. And what I love is that Dr. Roy doesn't just like throw this big idea at us and leave us hanging. He actually gives us all these tools to like connect with that visible spirit within ourselves.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
He's all about practical application.
Right. Like meditation prayer, understanding the symbolism of biblical stories, all that. It's like he's giving us a whole new toolkit for spiritual growth.
One of the tools I found really helpful was his explanation of the right mind and the left mind. It's like he's giving us a roadmap for understanding how our intuition and logic work together.
You know, at first I was a little skeptical about that whole right brain, left brain thing. I thought it was kind of oversimplified. But the way Dr. Roy explains it, it actually makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it's not about one being better than the other. It's about finding that balance.
Right. Listening to those gut feelings, that intuitive wisdom, but also using our logic to make sense of the world around us.
Exactly. And I think that balance is what allows us to make those really powerful connections with the divine, that contact that Dr. Roy talks about.
You know what's interesting is that he's so adamant that this contact isn't something we have to earn. It's already there.
It's our birthright, he says.
Right. But we get so caught up in like the day-to-day, the material world, that we forget about it.
Like we're all walking around with these invisible antennas that can tune into this divine frequency, but we just leave them switched off.
That is such a good analogy, and I really appreciate that Dr. Roy doesn't just say, hey, you're disconnected, figure it out. He actually gives us these specific practices to strengthen that connection.
Totally. Like, what are some of the things that work for you?
Honestly, spending time in nature is huge for me. Like, there's nothing like a good hike in the woods to clear my head and make me feel connected to something bigger than myself.
Absolutely.
Eh.
Meditation, prayer, acts of kindness. These are all ways to kind of turn up the volume on that divine channel.
Right. It's like those random acts of kindness are little bursts of spiritual energy that we're sending out into the world.
I love that perspective.
Yeah.
And one thing that really struck me about Dr. Roy's work is how optimistic and empowering it is. He's not saying we're doomed because of some original sin.
Or that we have to follow all these rules to be good.
Exactly. It's more like, hey, you're already amazing. You're already connected to something divine. Now let's explore what you can do with that power.
I love that. So empowering. And speaking of power, this is where faith comes in, right?
Yeah. But remember, Dr. Roy's definition of faith isn't about blindly believing in something.
Right.
It's about trusting in something deeper.
Yeah, like trusting those unseen forces that are supporting us, aligning our thoughts and beliefs with what we want to create. It's like he's saying we have this incredible power to shape our reality through our thoughts and beliefs. And that power is amplified when we're in contact with the divine.
He even uses the term God-man to describe this fully realized human being, someone who's tapped into their divine potential and is living in alignment with their purpose.
And he uses Jesus as the ultimate example of the God-man, right?
Gazo.
Yeah.
But he's also clear that this isn't something that's reserved for saints and prophets. It's a potential that we all have within us.
Right. We all have that divine spark, that ability to express love, wisdom, compassion.
And, when you look at it that way, it makes those stories in the Bible feel so much more relatable. It's not about worshiping these distant figures, but about recognizing the potential that they represent, a potential that we all share.
Okay, so we've talked about the God-man, but what about the flip side? Dr. Roy uses Herod as an example of what happens when our ego runs the show, right?
Yeah, Herod is like the poster child for what he calls the carnal consciousness, that part of us that's driven by fear, greed, and the pursuit of power.
And John the Baptist, who Herod had beheaded, symbolizes that voice of conscience that gets silenced when ego takes over.
It's such a powerful metaphor. It's like this internal battle that we all face.
Right. We all have that Herod within us, but we also have the ability to choose a different path.
And that choice comes down to cultivating that contact, recognizing that we're not just these isolated individuals, but we're part of something so much greater.
We're visible spirit.
Right.
Expressions of the divine.
Exactly. And when we live from that place of connection, we tap into this power and love that can transform our lives and the world around us.
That is beautiful. I love that.
One of the things I found most profound was Dr. Roy's idea that every day is Father's Day.
Every day is Father's Day.
Yeah, it's not about setting aside one day a year to honor some distant figure, but about recognizing the presence of the divine in every single moment.
Oh, I love that. It's about celebrating that connection, that love that's always available to us.
It is. And that's what Dr. Roy's work is all about. It's an invitation to embrace that connection, to nurture it, and to let it guide us on our journey.
Well, I don't know about you, but I'm feeling super inspired and ready to put all this wisdom into practice.
Me too. And I hope our listeners are feeling the same. Remember, the journey of spiritual awakening is ongoing. There's always more to learn, more to experience.
So keep seeking, keep questioning, and most importantly, keep that contact alive within you.
That's the key. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been amazing. Until next time, happy diving, everyone.